This is co-authored with Bhamika Dharampala at the University of Chicago Law School. And what we're going to be doing in this paper, and I hope you're able to see the next slide that says overview. Can you?
Yes. Excellent.
So as many of you know, there's a growing emphasis on the social purpose and responsibility of corporations. And this is, of course, motivated in part by concerns over externalities and the sense that regulation and liability are not really working all that well. So we've seen a lot of scholarship and a lot of commentary begin to focus on looking at other things besides regulation and liability. One of these approaches is to look to index funds as universal owners who may encourage firms to take account of externalities. But as we'll argue in this paper, although there are concerns about the index funds incentives that others have covered in their work, most firms across the world and many in the US are controlled, as are most firms that are typically associated with larger externalities. Is there reason to think that the index funds would actually be influential here? And we're going to provide some at least suggestive evidence that probably not. But if controllers are, blunting to some extent the potential behavior of index funds, then that makes it important for us to understand the incentives of controllers. So we then began to develop a more general framework for thinking about and understanding how ownership structure and corporate law affect the internalization of externalities. And what we do is we start with the controller's pecuniary incentives, and we introduce a concept called controller's wealth concentration. We'll define it a little more when I get into the bulk of the presentation, but basically it's how much of the controller's net worth is tied up in the firm that they control. And if they have a low controller wealth concentration, then it's plausible that controllers might diversify, and that would put them in some respects in the position of a diversified owner of shares, and maybe they could be effective in policing some externalities. Dual class structures and controlling minority structures might facilitate this, at least in theory. But again, the evidence here suggests that few controllers actually have low controller wealth concentration, even when their firms have dual class structures or other controlling minority structures. And we think the likely reasons for why this is still the case make us doubtful that reforms would actually improve the situation much. And that sort of brings us back almost full circle to suggest that it's going to be very hard to avoid better regulation and liability by relying upon whether it's index funds or controllers to try to take into account externalities. Having said that, we think that there are actually some pretty interesting additional implications of our research in this paper. The most interesting, perhaps, are that most of the research thus far has focused on the effects of controllers on the value of the controlled firm. But our analysis is looking a little more broadly, which is what is the effect of controllers, not on just the controlled firm, but even beyond that. And then more generally, even looking at how ownership structure might impact externalities, thinking about how conglomerates or fund family ownership or state-owned enterprises might interact with externalities could be useful, at least in thinking through what kinds of reforms, if any, might be useful in doing certain kinds of things. Okay, with that as an overview, I thought I would launch into the basics of our paper. So as all of you know, the standard approach to regulating externalities is to use Pigouvian taxes, liability regimes, or regulation. But there does seem to be a general sense that these are not being used sufficiently to internalize externalities, some would argue in part due to political dynamics, among other reasons. And that's sort of encouraging people to look towards other kinds of supplements, or maybe even supplanting a regulation and liability. And one way that sort of the literature has moved towards, at least discussing, is to encourage index funds as universal owners to police for at least some kinds of cross-firm externalities. And there have been some very interesting papers in this space. Jeff Gordon is here, and then there's Jack Coffey and Madison Condon. But some have expressed skepticism about the ability of index funds or common owners to really be able to take firm externalities into account. Professor Babchak et al. Have argued this in multiple papers. But much of this literature is focused on the US and diffusely held firms, where you might think index funds would be more likely to have at least greater influence. But once you step out of the US, most firms are actually controlled. And indeed, many of the firms in the externality debate, the firms that are thought to be the largest producers of externalities, both in the US and elsewhere, are often thought to be controlled, which suggests essentially that if we're serious about index funds being able to police externalities, we need to really inquire, can they do this in controlled firms? And if not, then what alternatives should we be thinking about? All right, so we thought we would drill down a little bit more to look for any empirical evidence we can find on index fund engagements over the years. Fortunately for us, there's been a couple of recent papers that have begun to collate data that would be useful to such a question. Azar et al., which is forthcoming in the JFE, or I think is actually in the JFE now, they collect data on index funds' environmental engagements. And we're going to use their country level data from them, and we're actually updating it with firm level data that they kindly provided to us. We're also relying on Aminadav and Papa Ayonu, who have a JF paper that has ownership structure by country, and we identify countries with the greatest prevalence of listed firms that have dispersed ownership. Unsurprisingly, these are basically common law countries, the US and a few others. And what we basically find, and I don't think this would surprise anybody, is that index funds' environmental engagements are highly concentrated among firms in countries that have basically dispersed ownership. And that suggests, at least, that index funds themselves are not engaging, at least openly, very actively in controlled firms. And now, having said that, of course, I do want to caveat this by saying we can't observe behind the scenes meetings. So if index funds are, sort of taking a controller aside and saying, look, you should really think about doing things differently, we can't observe whether those are happening or whether they're even successful. It just seems odd to us that there's such a large difference if we think that they're going to be engaging in equivalent sorts of efforts. To give you a visual depiction of this, this is straight from the paper. This kind of gives you a sense as to where you're more likely to see index fund environmental engagements, and it's overwhelmingly in countries with dispersed ownership. For more of a regression-based view of this, we provide a very simplistic regression here, both a linear and a Poisson model. They're basically very similar. They're robust to the inclusion of controls. But like I said, none of this is really all that shocking because one would anticipate that the ability of index funds to persuade will be somewhat lower in controlled firms than in non-controlled firms. If they're not very active if index funds are not very active in monitoring or at least trying to influence controlling shareholders through engagements, does that matter for externalities? Well, it probably does, because it turns out that controlled firms are generally thought to be important to externalities. And just to give you sort of a simplistic pie chart here, the color you need to look for is the yellow. That's where there's no controller. So if you look at the 25 largest automobile manufacturers, approximately 90% of them are either controlled by a founder, family, state, or other non-state owner. Whereas if you look at the ownership structure of the largest energy firms, again, more than half of them are essentially controlled. And we didn't bother to put up a pie chart of the top 25 tech firms because you would see only one color. They're all controlled. So that to the extent that you think, for example, those three sectors are indicative of sort of externalities in various industries, looking at controllers is actually going to be very important. And if index funds are not really able or capable of or willing to engage and have an impact there, then their ability to pick up any perceived slack from poor regulation is going to be pretty weak. Having said that, if controllers are that important, then maybe we really should look at their incentives, not just the index funds. And that brings us to sort of the more theoretical or maybe the more conceptual part of the paper, where we begin looking at the pecuniary incentives of controllers with respect to cross-firm externalities. And to do this, we're going to basically introduce a concept called controller wealth concentration. This is the ratio or the percentage of the controller's holdings in their firm compared to the controller's total personal net worth. For example, someone like Mark Zuckerberg has approximately 90+% of their total net worth tied up in Meta. He would have a very, very high controller wealth concentration, whereas others who may have much lower may have a low controller wealth concentration. And the notion here is that when you have high controller wealth concentration, your pecuniary incentives do not really encourage you to take cross-firm externalities into account. Now, of course, not all externalities will hit other firms that are publicly traded, but to the extent they do, you don't have a strong incentive to take them into account. Low controller wealth concentration, of course, provides at least the possibility that the controller might diversify. And if they do, then they might have incentives to take cross-firm externalities into account. That basically means that low controller wealth concentration is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for controller diversification. And diversified controllers are, of course, better positioned to influence a controlled firm than index funds because, to sort of riff on the tautology here, they control it. So they're, of course, in a better position to do something about it. Now, note, this is, of course, a shift in focus. Most of the corporate governance scholarship focuses on the controller's interests and the impact on the controlled firm and its value. Here, we're, of course, focusing more on the impact of controllers on cross-firm externalities beyond just the firm itself. In the paper, then, we sort of provide what is probably a too long of a description of how dual class structures and controlling minority structures can facilitate controller diversification. And of course, I'll just put up a chart here. We can talk about it if people are interested. But basically, the idea here is that when you have dual class, that permits the controller to retain control, but still begin to sell down their common stock, which of course may induce them to be more likely to diversify and be willing to maybe take into account cross-firm externalities. So one sort of interesting thing is, do we actually see controllers in dual class firms beginning to go towards low controller wealth concentration? Do we even see them doing it outside of dual class firms? We have very spotty data on this. I will try to present it as simply as I can. Basically, we look at about 25 or 30 firms on which we can get data and controlling shareholders on which we can get somewhat reliable data on their net worth. What we basically find is that controller shares of controlled firms are often low, that is suggesting they're using some kind of controlling minority structure, but nonetheless, their wealth concentration is pretty high. So even when they do use dual class structures or controlling minority structures, we don't see them diversifying much, suggesting that they're also not well positioned from a pecuniary perspective to take externalities into account. For sort of just a sense of what our sample looked like, we just circled Zuckerberg here because he's fairly well known, I guess. But as you can see, almost all the time, except for one or two companies, you see very, very few people who are controllers who don't have a very, very large chunk of their fortune tied up in the company. You typically see higher controlling wealth concentrations. Now that, of course, raises its own sort of set of questions, which is, why don't controllers diversify? I mean, basic finance tells you that you're overweighted in your own firm. Why don't you diversify a little bit? Especially since you could rely on controlling minority structures to facilitate your diversification while maintaining control, right? But it seems like very few controllers are doing that. The literature actually has tried to address this question in various ways. One, of course, is the notion that maybe the founders have an optimism bias. They think they don't need to diversify because their firm is the best firm out there and it will generate the highest returns from now until time immemorial. That's a possibility. It's well known that founders of startups do tend to be on the optimistic side. I suppose you'd have to be. An alternative or maybe a supplementary story is that there may actually be higher private benefits of control, so they wish to retain control and exercise. It might also be the case that either the controller or the other shareholders in the company want to incentivize the controller's effort and then make them be a little bit more overweighted. There are also reasons from the capital gains perspective why you might prefer not to sell your shares and diversify, because you would essentially incur a more automatic capital gains tax, a more immediate one, than if you deferred such a sale, or even if you passed it on to your beneficiaries in your will. In conversations with people in both the VC side and others, it appears that sometimes controllers actually borrow against their shares, so they don't actually sell down shares, but they imply out some of the value and use that to do some degree of diversification. But on that, we have precious little data. We looked also at whether there were any restrictions from corporate law that might curtail controllers' incentives to think about others or look at trying to contain externalities. We don't really think there are serious constraints from corporate law. I mean, unless you're, of course, baldly saying you would like to lose money. But most of the time, it's not difficult to characterize a choice to, reduce externalities as being beneficial to the firm in the long run anyway. And of course, this may actually coincide with the interests of diversified minority shareholders. We don't think that corporate law itself restricts this. We think it's more likely that some of the other points we raised on the other slide are more significant. That, of course, suggests that attempting to reform or encourage controllers to either diversify or do more to take these externalities into account may not be terribly fruitful. We go through a litany of potential reforms that might do this, and we're not terribly confident that they will, partially because some countries have tried this and it doesn't seem to have done much, at least not from what we can tell. Although at this stage, I think our analysis is based more on anecdote than on detailed empirical study. It's hard to find examples where you see a lot of low controller wealth concentration. All right, of course, that also triggers broader research questions. As we mentioned a couple of times now, much of the research is on controllers on their own firm value. We're suggesting maybe let's think about how they might impact things beyond their own firm. And then, of course, more generally, why not think about how conglomerates or fund families or SOEs might begin to impact externalities? To the extent one thinks that regulation and liability are incurable or cannot be cured at tolerable cost, then if you want to look at ownership structure, why not look at the most common ownership structures and then look at the different forms in which they might actually begin to impact externalities and different kinds of externalities. I don't think all externalities can be regulated through this way, but at least it's worth thinking about as one gets into it more. All right, and that brings me to my conclusion slide, and I think I'm still within time. But basically, as I mentioned, much of the motivation for looking at index funds and others are concerns about internalizing externalities through liability and regulation. The push towards universal owners, we think there are issues with how it might work in the U.S. But I think once you go outside the U.S., it becomes much harder to make a strong claim for it. Controlled firms are the norm globally, and also they're often dominant in externalities. Index funds, to the extent we have evidence, and it is of course suggestive, doesn't look like they're doing much engagement there. So one is not terribly optimistic about that. But you could look at controllers' incentives. We introduced the concept of controller wealth concentration, but there too we find that even with dual class structures and others, controllers typically do not have very low controller wealth concentration. And we think the reasons for that make it not very likely that major reforms could have much impact. Nonetheless, that does allow us to start thinking more broadly about the connection between ownership structure and internalizing externalities, which may be important and useful to look at if we think regulation and liability are going to be limited in some ways, and that this may provide some alternative ways in which to explore how to internalize these externalities, or at least have companies begin to take them into account. And with that, I'll stop. I hope I'm not over time, Eric.
You are 1 minute shy, amigo. So well
Perfect.
done. Yeah.
Thank you.
1 minute shy on the last panel of the day elicited quite a rousing applause, by the way. So
thank you.
All right, and our commentator also on Zoom is Yupana. Go ahead and take it away.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. You see my slide well? Okay. Hello, everybody. It's midnight in Singapore. I'm trying to stay up until late. I'm so sorry I'm not able to join you there. The main reason is that it's not about COVID, but related to COVID, I couldn't get visa. Okay. It's my honor to be the last presenter of the conference. I will try to be short. So the paper is very interesting. The main idea is that the paper looking at how to incentivize the controlling shareholder to do good. And this topic is very important because there are controlling shareholders everywhere. not just in the US, but around the world. And they are big. They control large firms. For example, fund firms alone represent around 13% of S&P 500. Now, the problem, So the problem is that these controlling shareholders, they put too much of their wealth in one firm. For example, in the case of Mark Zuckerberg, he invested around 94% of his wealth in Facebook. Having such a high financial investment in one firm, of course, Facebook is very important to him, and he is more likely that he will ignore other firms. So in the context of externalities, he's unlikely to avoid negative effects from activities that Facebook might generate on other firms. Now, the paper looked into index fund and trying to understand whether index fund would have any incentive and capability to influence controlling shareholders regarding externalities. And the paper showed that, in terms of incentive, the index fund actually own quite a bit of equity, but it's difficult for them to influence controlling shareholder simply because the controlling shareholder hold a lot of voting rights. This is in the case of Google. The three controlling shareholders on together, they vote 56%, making fund manager hopeless. So now, what to do? How to make the controlling shareholder be pro-social? So the paper suggested that why don't we mimic the index fund by having the controlling shareholder behave like large and diversified index funds. What does it mean? So instead of holding just one firm, a controlling shareholder should diversify by investing in several firms. And as he controls many, many more firms, the controlling shareholder would then act like a common owner. That is more likely to internalize externalities generated by their group firms. Now, the paper argued further that a controlling shareholder might be better positioned to not only influence corporate decisions of group firms, but also coordinate their corporate activities. There is also less agency problem compared with fund managers. Now, given that the controlling shareholder have limited wealth, how to achieve this diversified portfolio? The paper suggested a very powerful weapon, which is using dual class shares. Now, the idea sounds very nice, but how come diversified controlling shareholders are so rare, at least in the US? The paper come up with a number of reasons. In particular, founders are over-optimistic about the firm that they founded, so they overloaded their portfolio with their own firm. I found that the paper is very interesting, have very interesting implication, and the idea also innovative. In contrast to the literature, dual class share can be beneficial and can be used to incentivize the controlling shareholder to be pro-social by diversification. When I first read the paper, my impression was, wow, the paper is going to take us to the world with robber barons in the digital age. That means taking us back 100 years in time. So let me start by asking a few questions that I don't quite understand from reading the paper, in particular about the model. How does the model exactly work? First, I was wondering why would the controlling shareholder need to be incentivized to be pro-social? And the paper applied the concept outlined in the common ownership literature to explain the mechanism. However, the common ownership literature is developed based on the institutional investor point of view. Controlling shareholders are, however, play a different role in the firm. Institutional investors are outsiders. But the controlling shareholder is the super commander who often take the title of CEO or chairman and making the key decision in the firm. So we need a different model. We need a formal model to guide why a diversified controlling shareholder would internalize externalities and why. In particular, what is exactly what the objective function of the controlling shareholders? So it seemed to me like the controlling shareholder maximize the whole group firm value, not a particular company per se. And how do externality come in here? Perhaps the controlling shareholder would take into account the impacts of activities of group firms, because by doing so would serve his ultimate goal of group value maximization. That is, he would coordinate his group firms when choosing corporate policy and would avoid activities that reduce overall group value. I think it'd be good to have the clear objective function of the controlling shareholder. Is it about maximize group value by doing good? Or is it about maximizing social impact and group value? Or it's about maximize something else? Now, diversification seems to be the key here that helps to make controlling shareholder to be pro-social. So according to the model, then the more firms that one controls, the bigger social impact that one could generate. Now, a controlling shareholder, even though he is rich, but he's not that rich when compared with index funds that have massive amount of money that can own stock from all over the world. So with the limited wealth, I think it'd be nice that there should be some guideline on investment strategy so that the controlling shareholder would achieve social impact and group value maximization. So should be some guideline, like what sorts of externality that one should focus, or which firms should he own and in which industry. So I'm trying to virtualize how it works really about the controlling shareholder internalizing externality across the firms. So let me use one case to highlight my points. This is the richest controlling shareholder in America, and his net worth is about 218 billion. He owns a lot of most of his wealth in Tesla. And how maybe you use the model to guide him? How can we incentivize him to make the world good? So this is his portfolio at the moment. He owns Tesla. 68% of his wealth is on Tesla, and then he has a business in space, telecom, medicine, military, gaming, AI machine, and some boring things like infrastructure, real estate, and shipping. Now, how can we apply the model in the paper to understand this? How does the incentive mechanism work within the group firms? I thought it'd be nice to have some example to elaborate what it means by internalizing externality across these 8 firms. And what are externalities that the firm are encountering and trying to solve? And what sorts of action that he could coordinate among these 8 firms to minimize externalities and at the same time eventually maximize the group value? I mean, externality is a big thing, maybe difficult to understand. Maybe we could be less ambitious and focus like small thing like reduce CO2 will make it easy to understand the model. Now the next question is, if he wants to reduce CO2, then how should he allocate his wealth into owning which firm, how many percent? I'm talking about the portfolio choice. Is it the right choice if he wants to solve CO2, or should he sell them all and then focus on the auto industry? But auto industry also big. Should he also own some of all the US firms like Ford, GM, Daimler, or should also own global firms like Toyota, Tata, BMW? And now, what about the market share? How many percent of the other firms should he control so that he had enough impact, and how far in the supply chain. We know that automobile industry, the cars had hundreds of suppliers. How far in the industry that he should also, own the firms. Now, automakers are only small part of CO2 producers. Should he also own other industry so that he could, internalize the externality and solve the CO2 problem? Now, the outcome, I think, of the paper is that, we are encouraging controlling shareholders to be more diversified by dual class share. The outcome is that they will control even a bigger business empire and worth much more than their wealth, and therefore would increase their economic power. Now, could the model work? Shall we look at, business groups in Asia and Latin America that appear like what the paper proposes? There is a handful of controlling shareholders own diversified portfolio, include an extensive number of firms, and often in various industries. They use pyramids and cross-shareholding to control the firms, which has a similar effect to dual class shares. Let me show you example from Korea, which is spectacular, that the five families, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Lotte, and SK, the five families control almost 50% of Korea's GDP. And Samsung in particular is huge. In 2009, its revenue is about 16% of Korea's GDP. And this is at its peak in 2010. The group structure is so complicated. There were more than 100 firms in here. Even the most active hedge fund, the Elias Fund, couldn't understand this and proposed to simplify the group structure. This was in 2015. This is the Elias Fund version of Samsung. Now, what do? They do everything. So if you live in Korea, basically you could just live with a Korea products and services. And if in the weekend you are tired, you can go to the amusement park as well. So I'm bringing this topic up because I thought there are business groups here and there, in particular in Asia. We could use this business group to put, as a research setting to test the hypothesis in the paper. Do business groups really internalize externalities, and in which way? And do countries with business group have relative less environmental issue than other countries? Okay, it's so much to learn from this before we go on to have some, regulation or something to encourage the firm to own to build business group. Now, come back to our classic question: should we entrust corporate governance in a handful of super rich? We already had bad experience 100 years ago, and the U.S. government came up and broke the business group, and then a long list of literature talking about potential concerns coming from concentrated ownership and control, in particular about anti-competition, about the expropriation of minority shareholder, and in the worst case, controlling shareholder could capture the state and try to influence economic policy for their own interest. Now, my last point is that do controlling shareholders need to be incentivized to be pro-social? And my idea is no, because the controlling shareholder founded the firm, they already invested a lot of wealth in the firm. They also enjoy a lot of private benefit from running the firm. And then their reputation also tied to the firm's success. So they should already have enough long-term incentive. But I think the paper points out a very good point that how should we make a controlling shareholder be responsible shareholders? And I think about incentive is a secondary effect. In my opinion, the primary task is to define the right corporate purpose. Many papers are now talking about this. I think the paper is very nice, and I learned a lot from reading the paper. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. So Vic, do you want to say a few words just in reaction before questions, or do you want to get questions first?
Sure. I'll just say a couple of quick things. So first of all, thank you so much for your commentary. I appreciate it. Second, I think it would be lovely to have case studies that explore sort of what the large business groups do, because it would be instructive in some ways. I would say, however, that the hypothetical we posed about a diversified controller doesn't require the controller to control all the firms that they're diversifying into, as you would in a conglomerate. You could imagine a controller maintaining control in the firm they founded and then using some of the money they made from that to just buy a diversified portfolio. That would be sufficient to get the incentive effect, which is to be thinking about the effect on other firms that are in your portfolio. But the conglomerate, I think, is an interesting example. It's not the only way you could diversify, but it's certainly a very common way. And it would be interesting to sort of see what happens. Although I agree, it's complicated by the fact that environments in which you see conglomerates often are environments where you might also be worried about the antitrust concerns you sort of mentioned at the tail end of your commentary. But thank you, those are very helpful.
You've got a lot of questions in the room here, Vic, so we may pair them off. That might be a good way to do this. We're going to start with Elizabeth Pullman.
Hi, Vic. It's Elizabeth. This is such a fun topic to think about, and it's partly fun because it's like a combination of two kind of hot areas in the literature, putting them together. So I wonder what you think of an additional explanation that came to mind for me about why these controlling shareholders don't diversify more. It seemed to me like you had a pretty limited list and you weren't really getting into the mind of these billionaires. Because when I think about putting myself in those people's situations, they know they're like, I looked at that list you had when you presented it. These are mostly like very famous people that have large egos and it's like extraordinary wealth. So to me, another reason might be just the sheer magnitude of wealth that we're talking about, which isn't usually put on these lists of why you don't see this, but it is so much money that even if the stock price goes way down, and we've seen tech companies down a lot just recently, they just still have so much wealth it doesn't matter as far as like maximizing like for like, I don't know, like having enough money in your lifetime and for your children or whatever other things you'd be doing, like just the magnitude of wealth. And then I wonder, there's a lot of things that I think get lost in just using a term like private benefits of control that you had on there. Because when you're putting yourself in the mind, again, it's not just the magnitude of the wealth, but these are people who had a reputation and a legacy that's closely tied to that firm's reputation. And so if they sell a lot of that, that's going to be reported. And they don't want their reputation, ego, style, cool. It's not very cool to sell a lot of the company stock that you founded. There's a lot of other words you could use, and maybe you call that private benefits of control, but actually I think it's something else slightly. And even if they do, the thing is, I don't know why you would believe that what they would want to do then is think about externalities, because these people, what we know of them, I think in large part, not to overgeneralize about these people, but they want to do good in the way they want to do good. So recall like Zuckerberg actually tried to do that whole recapitalization so he could create a bigger wedge and do that Class C, remember? So they could do the Zuckerberg-Chan initiative. They wanted to spend on the types of good that they wanted to spend on, not necessarily the type of externalities that Facebook was creating. And you see also like with Jeff Bezos and his ex-wife, Mackenzie Scott, a kind of similar thing. They want to spend on the philanthropy they want. It's not necessarily the same type of thing to draw parallel to like index funds and the literature that like Jeff Gordon and Madison Condon have contributed to. So I wonder what you think of that. Thanks.
Hold the thought, Vic. Hold the thought. We're going to get one more question.
Hi, Vic. It's Dan Puchniak.
Hi.
Yeah, a thought that came to me is with an actual real-world example of this. As you may know, stewardship codes have spread around the world, and the curious thing is they're designed for institutional investors, but they've been put into controlling jurisdictions without taking account of this, even though there's not many institutional investors and you have controlled firms. But there's one exception to this around the world, which is in Singapore, where they've designed a stewardship code, the only one in the world, for family firms. And it is designed to try to force them to take externalities. One of the principles is to do good, do well, and all of the Singapore family firms signed up because why not? It's good to look good, but it suffered from the same incentive problems that you have with stewardship generally, which is it was soft law. There's no reporting. There's no following up. But at least that's an example, I think, of a real-world thing to do that. The last point that I want to make is just with state-owned enterprises, which is that you take Temasek in Singapore, for instance, and on the state level, I think when you find that the controlling shareholder is the state, I think they have a strategy to diversify. So I would also like to hear what you have to say about that, where when you get in the state realm, they actually actively do this. At least I would think, although you'd have to look broader.
All right, Vic, you want to go ahead and take on these two questions, then we'll do another pair.
Sure. So thanks for both the questions. On Liz's, it's we don't know that much about what all of the incentives are of the controlling shareholders of their groups, and what one might motivate them to do what. I do think that legacy matters a great deal, and I think also image matters a great deal. They don't want to look like they're the captain, abandoning the ship, right? As you sort of suggested. I suspect that's why when we had our conversations with some folks in the VC sector, they said, yeah, they never sell. They just simply borrow against it, right? And that seemed like actually, in a way, they were trying to do both. That is, maintain their, that image, but still actually diversify, right? So that was kind of interesting to us. Now, would they actually think about externalities if they diversified? I don't know. I mean, they would at least have a pecuniary incentive to do so if they diversified, if those externalities were hitting the firms or the set of firms that they invested in. They certainly have a stronger incentive to care than if they had no investment in those other firms. Now, of course, it could be the case that if you have, 80% of your wealth tied up in your controlled firm, even if you diversify a little, it won't make much difference. Sorry, I have a little bit of an allergy. So I think the general question of controllers' incentives is important. On the second issue, on the real-world example, thank you. I'll look at the Singapore Code. We've both Dominic and I have thought a lot about SOEs, because SOEs are ubiquitous in many ways, and you do see things like Temasek that are attempting to diversify in some ways. We don't yet know. We're sort of in the process of gathering case studies and data to see what, if anything, they do. Do they do anything that is very, very visible or impactful? So any examples you have are going to be completely welcomed by me, and I'm sure by Dominica too. It would be interesting to sort of dig a little deeper in the Singapore example as to why the stewardship code, when all of the firms signed on, which I agree with probably PR, why none of them seem to be doing what you would kind of want them to do. Let's say if you had pushed for the stewardship code, I think they're sort of different. Again, it's incentives. What incentives do they have to care if they're not actually invested in the firms that may suffer a negative hit from this sort of an impact? But we're very keen to get more examples, because although we don't actually think like dual class is a solution to this, it is indeed the bottom line of the paper is you can't get around better regulation and liability. That's the problem, right? What you need is better regulation and liability. But if you think you've reached whatever limit you've reached with liability and regulation, maybe thinking about ownership structure and how you can maybe tweak it, incentivize it, could be useful at the margins. But I don't think you can think of it as a substitute for actual regulation and liability.
Two more questions. I think you're on.
Can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me? Cage from Seoul National University. I have one technical question on the concept of the CWC. The controller may diversify his investment by directly owning the shares of various firms, or he may indirectly do so by owning the holding company that owns various subsidiaries. So I'm not sure how you address that issue in calculating the CWC. So the list you showed to us include the LG and Samsung, the large two Korean companies, and the LG CWC is indicated as high, 95%, and the Samsung Electronics CWCs indicated much lower, like 57%. But as far as I know, in substance, they are not very different in terms of diversification. The control of the LG has stake in various companies through the holding company structure, while the control of the Samsung has stake in various companies directly without a holding company. So I think the CWC, well, I wonder whether the CWC should be calculated differently in this situation, and probably you need to look into this data a little bit more.
And then, Vic, I've got a question that's actually right along these same lines with the CWCs. So it is actually a little reminiscent to one of the points that Yupana made, which is that I think about these controllers that are trying to solve an externality problem. Well, it's not identical, of course, but it's not completely unidentical to the IO of repeat game theory from the 1980s and early 1990s, right? Where the externality that's being solved there is the externality that people are just too competitive in price and we want to form a cartel, right? And so repeat game theory sort of provided one reason why cartels might be stable and under what circumstances they might be. And so while you were talking, I was actually like noodling around with a folk theorem problem, asking whether the concentration of wealth in that firm would have any effect on the underlying necessary and sufficient conditions for stability of an equilibrium of price fixing. And I think it basically just cancels out. So I'm trying to get a sense of why it would come back into play in this context when you wouldn't necessarily see it in the generic sort of repeat game cartel.
Okay, excellent. So let me begin with the earlier question on the data on controller wealth concentration. We recognize that the data we have is, shall we describe it as spotty? The reason for that, of course, is that it's very hard to actually get the denominator in the CWC, which is what is the controller's net worth. That is often not that straightforward. And especially when you get into conglomerate structures or business groups, it's even more kind of atmospheric, I think. And that makes it challenging. So we're very open to refining, how we measured in different contexts. We just used what data we could find. But we welcome suggestions for additional data to refine the measure and actually to include more firms. Of course, it's being used in the paper as a theoretical construct to sort of understand when might, controllers be inclined to diversify when they have low controller wealth concentration, and then sort of how does that impact their likely incentives to take certain externalities into account. Now, Eric's point, I always love any reference to scholarship from the 1980s and 90s, because that, of course, is the best era. As you can guess what era I must have grown up in. But that's an interesting point. So I would have to think about that a little more. I haven't puzzled through the folk theorem in a while. I wonder if I guess the notion here is that you're talking about what are the preconditions for a cartel to be stable when they don't have an ability to enforce it. Is that essentially the gist of that argument? I mean,
the whole idea is that if you cheat on our cartel, we have some punishment strategy that's an equilibrium as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I would have to think. And you were saying the literature basically found that did work.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys, if you're going to set up a model to do this, and I would encourage you to do it, try to use that as your benchmark, and then tell me why this is going to be different, why wealth concentration matters here, where it seems to cancel out in the other case. Vic, we're going to hit you with a troika of questions now, just because you're doing so well with pairs.
Okay.
All right.
Right. Just a quick one. So I think you're rightly saying that holding on to these clusters, this wealth concentration doesn't make sense from a financial point of view because you forego all the diversification benefits. Now, the strange thing which hits me is that then, in order to solve the externalities problem, you're introducing a financial motive, which is if you diversify, then all of a sudden you are coming up with pocketing more of the costs, and therefore you should do it. And I think the one way of addressing the problem is really looking into why they are holding on to their blocks in the first place. And there's this literature pioneered by Asaf Handani and Zohar Goshen, which talks about entrepreneurial vision. And so it's a non-financial motive in the first place. And if that's correct, then maybe the financial motivation that you get at the margin, as you rightly say, in addition, might not matter that much anyway. So maybe it's really about this and the entrepreneurial vision. I mean, these are individuals like me and you. So therefore, although we don't have any financial implications waiting, we still care about the environment and we still don't use paper cups and stuff like that. So therefore, I would encourage you to look into this direction as well.
We're going to hand this off. Ron?
The issue that I'm thinking about here is what kind of externalities are we really focused on? Are we talking about national externalities or are we talking about global externalities? And most of your solutions seem like they're focused at the national level. So I think it's worth thinking more about other types of structures that maybe would handle international externalities in terms of global operations of some corporations, or also, what are the benefits of business groups or SEOs? They tend to be very specific to individual countries, I think.
Okay, hold the thought. Vic, one more question.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Eric here. And very, very shortly, I'd just like to mention Sweden in this context. We have controlling shareholders in, I think, somewhere around 60-70% of the firms. Most of them are using dual class structures as well. And one of the things we discuss a lot in this context here, or in Sweden, is why these owners behave in the way they do, and why they take these type of societal responsibilities that they do, because they tend to. And we think, at least, or the predominant theory, I think, is that it's just like Elizabeth said, it's not very much about the money, it's about the personal brand and the kind of societal pillar role they play in the country, which makes it much more worthwhile for them to do these things and then using strategies which would generate additional wealth, which would anyway be useless to them.
All right, Vic, you've got 2.5 minutes to vindicate your honor.
Well, I mean, much more than that, but okay. So on the first question here in this group, so yes, I agree. Asaf and Zohar's influential paper is very helpful to look at. My understanding of their paper was more along the lines of that they were talking about why do people, why might control be valuable, to the firm and to the controller. In our paper, one of the things that's interesting is that they can get those benefits, those idiosyncratic benefits, through a dual class structure and then diversify as well, so they could have their cake and eat it too, but they don't seem to. So that's a puzzle for us in some ways. On Ron's point, in various parts of the paper, we give examples of different kinds of externalities to show how the analysis might look a little different depending on the kind of externality you're looking at. So I completely agree with you that there are likely to be differences. We don't cash them all out because we kind of recognize when we started doing the various externalities that the exact impact is going to vary substantially. So if we just give a couple of potted examples, it'll be easy to sort of generate a fuller continuum. But that's kind of where we would like, or at least we'd encourage people to think about the issue, which is looking at ownership structure to solve externalities doesn't work across the board for all externalities the same way. And indeed, that's a major point of the paper, is that even if you think about ownership structure, you can't simply use it to supplement or get rid of liability and regulation because it doesn't have a uniform effect. You're going to have to look through it in each step. And then finally, on the Swedish point, I think a lot of times the incentives of controllers in certain environments are going to be motivated substantially by the social norms and by the social goals that both that they're subject to and that they've of course internalized, and that would of course make a big difference. Now, the extent to which social norms are binding in different environments is, I think, open for some discussion. But I would agree that we're not suggesting that the only thing that matters to controllers are pecuniary incentives. They can surely have other incentives, but to the extent that they don't have any pecuniary incentives because of their high controller wealth concentration, to worry about cross-firm externalities, then if they were to diversify a little, they would at least have some pecuniary incentives, and that hopefully would matter at least at the margin. But of course, they're motivated by more than just the money. If it was just the money, I'd be eating Hostess Twinkies all day. Instead, I care about other things too. So I'll attempt to eat something that might qualify as being healthy too.
All right.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you.
So our conference is coming to a close, and it is now for me to close the conference. And the ultimate wrap-up will be done by Luca, so he will discuss everything that we have to say. So it's for me only essentially to thank a lot of people who have made this possible. And in front of all of this is, of course, the ECGI team, headed by Elaine. She's now left the room. But I keep saying this through the years. She's obviously the upfront of the ECGI, but she's not alone. So there's also Suzanne Harley and Noreen Khan that you partly have seen because Suzanne has been moving around in the room and has made all of this possible and brought you all here to essentially to Oxford. And then, of course, and Noreen has worked in the background on particularly the good online outlook that all the other participants had. And then, of course, the Oxford team, and there is also on the administrative side Anne-Marie McBrien, who has made everything possible and made it so easy for the ECGI team to really pull all this together. And then, also on the Oxford side, of course, the people who have worked in the background and screening papers, not only Colin and Luca, but also Kristen van Swieten, John Armour, Paul Davis, Jennifer Payne, and Rupert Younger. And last but certainly not least, also the tech team, so Darius, James, Gary, and Tim, who have made this such a pleasant and smooth experience. And a special word of thanks also to Tom Gosling, who is now our default moderator for panels. He was not supposed to, but he did a great job. So. And finally, it is also for me to thank the GCGC partners who fund this great conference to a great deal. And therefore, there's also a great thanks to this very wonderful conference, not only intellectually, but also on every other dimension. So thanks a lot. And with that, I turn it over to Luca to really wrap it up. Thank you.
Yes, that would have been the last thing I would have done, to thank Tobias. So we start with the end. And so going back to the beginning, first of all, I would like to, I have to announce that next year's GCGC will be in Seoul, at the Seoul National University. We have here 2 representatives, and we are looking forward to choosing the papers for next year. Second, I would like to thank all of you and those online also for your attention, for the active participation. I spoke with some doctoral students who were here throughout the 2 days. Some of them told me that it was their first academic conference, and I think they were so impressed. I think we gave them a good example of academia at its best during these 2 days.